landscape trees, although they can be and they should be. So I'm going to take the angle of approaching it from a forest side. And I'm also we're going to talk a little bit about invasive species. I know you've had that subject in recent past, and it's a lot of folks, especially master gardeners, are well versed in invasive species, but I thought that'd be a useful context to to add to this as well. So to start with, just for fun, feel free to use the chat for interacting with some questions I'll put out there. The tree on the left and the tree on the right. One is native and the other is invasive. So what do you think? And these happen to be my two favorites. My favorite invasive, that's a little bit weird way to put it, but it's like my favorite one to hate, and my favorite tree. So let me open up the chat and see what I can see here from your interacting. I see nothing so far. Left is native. My left or your left? Okay, thank you for guessing. The one with the truck is actually my favorite tree to hate. It is a non-native invasive, and we're going to get to that, so I'll leave that a little bit cloaked in mystery in case you don't know, and you can look forward to finding out. And the one on the right is my favorite native tree. I am not a native of Virginia, speaking of being native. I did my undergraduate training at Purdue, and when I was in a field class in the woods for a lab, I had the idea, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, the light bulb moment, like, hey, if I'm going to be a forester, I should have a favorite tree. It was just this moment, and I couldn't do anything else until I picked one. So I looked around in the woods. I was like, I like that tree, and I happened to know what it was. And so that has become my favorite tree. I also leave that cloaked in darkness for the next few minutes until we get there. So thank you again for being here. Let's jump into it. This is the flower, by the way, of my favorite tree, so that may give it away for some of you. And so we're going to take a look at some great natives. Excuse me. And as I was preparing for this presentation, I was doing a little bit of multitasking, and the quote from someone famous, I wonder if you know who said this: when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. Now, I thought, and apparently I'm not the only one, that the quote went something like, you tug on something and you find it connected to everything else. That's actually a misquote of John Muir, who said the quote that I have here on this slide. And I thought, I'll just throw this in here, because when we do anything, whether it's with natives or invasives, it's a connected system. And so, especially when we're talking about invasives, if we're putting invasives in our landscape, it's not just isolated. It ends up being a problem in the native area or in the natural area. So let's move on. This is how I'm going to sort of organize the talk, with the column on the right-hand side. This is the top tree species in Virginia, top 10 by volume, i.e. how much wood there is, and then by number of trees. And this is based on forest and inventory analysis data that the United States Forest Service contracts with the state, the Virginia Department of Forestry, to conduct. So this is hard data. And it's interesting to watch this change over time. So by volume, loblolly pine and yellow poplar are our top 2 species. By number of trees, red maple is the top. You see red maple in the middle by volume. Another thing to point out is oak. Look at where oak is by volume. It's number 4, the species of white oak. And then by number of trees, it's down there 3rd from the bottom. And that is a challenge that we are facing in our forest lands, is that there's an old group of oak on the landscape, not just white oak, but northern red, southern red. And we're losing that in regeneration. And this simple list illustrates that quite well. So I might touch on that a little bit more too, but we're going to work through the list on the right-hand side. How many species of native trees do you think there are in Virginia? Well, I don't know the answer, so you can throw out anything. But I do know that in the Virginia Department of Forestry has a common native trees book, and there are somewhere on the order of 78 species in this book. So these are common native trees. And we're going to look at the top 10 or the top 10 most common by number of trees for the next few minutes. So let's start with number one. You know, number one's an awful tough spot to be because you get a lot of attention. And this does have our attention. Red maple being number one in terms of number of trees in Virginia is a bit of a challenge. It is reflective of the mesification or the moistening of our forest, of our landscape, and a change in how land is used. So in one way, it's illustrative of good management because we have better soils than we did 100 years ago. Not as much erosion from bad practices with both agriculture and forestry. But as a result, red maple has become the most common species and oak is declining. This is the M in madcap horse for those of you who may remember that from Tree ID. The maple is opposite in branch arrangement, ash opposite, dogwood opposite, except for alternate leaf dogwood and so on. There's some people who, first of all, think about this being a toxic species. And wilted leaves for horses or other livestock can be toxic in large enough quantities. But I'll just say something that one of my colleagues says. Alcohol for people, a beer, a glass of wine, that's also toxic. So it's all a matter of how much, right? Things in moderation may not be, lethal. When we think about maple as a genus, Acer genus, many people think about sugar maple as a popular tree, and it sure is because of the maple syrup production. But believe it or not, red maple has become a very popular tree to tap. In fact, I've been told by maple producers that in all the winning maple syrup blends, red maple sap is part of that, is a component in that. It is not as much volume, not as high sugar content, but it can produce syrup just in the same way that sugar maple does. And there are so many cultivars in Dur. There are 58 cultivars I just counted. And I may not have the most current Dur. The one that I have, he references that 20 cultivars had been added since the previous edition. So it's a very popular tree on the landscape. And this map, I'll have this map for each species, shows its native range. This has one of the largest, widest, most extensive native ranges of any tree. And it'll grow in any kind of condition as well, from dry to wet. So very common tree. Some pictures of it. Now, when you say red maple, a lot of people think about the fall color. And here's a little picture I just snipped off of the internet. And it's funny because one of these is a red maple and one of them is a sugar maple. And not all red maples turn red in the fall. Sometimes they're just yellow. So there's a lot of variability in the fall color of this species. It's mostly red in its name, Acer rubrum, based on its flowers, the lower left-hand corner. Its fruit or seeds, the little whirligig helicopter seeds, they're in the bottom middle, and its twig, the new growth, which you can see in that picture on the upper right. The red part of that is 1 year's growth, and that is always red as well. All right, and the bark, kind of just looks a little bit shaggy. This tree, in most cases, is not a very, magnificent looking tree. It tends to be a little bit scruffy. I don't know, is the word I would use, but it can tolerate all kinds of sites. And because it has so much cultivar work done with it, there are different shapes: columnar, pyramidal, short, tall, so on, etc. All right, some other native maples, because the Acer genus is a big group in Virginia. The other maples in Virginia, native maples, are sugar, silver, striped, and box elder. Box elder doesn't look like a maple leaf. It is a compound leaf. But all of these are opposite in leaf arrangement, and they all have those maple-shaped seeds, and so those would be some things that would give it away. Some less common species, mountain maple and black maple. I've actually not even seen these in Virginia, so they're quite less common. The pictures I have here are striped maple. Curious to see how many of you have seen striped maple. If you go hiking up in the mountains, you will see it there. But this bark is so unique. It's not a big tree, only gets maybe large tree, the diameter of the trunk would maybe be 4 inches. That would be a large tree, but very unique bark. All right, question for you. What's the most common non-native maple in Virginia? Exactly, Norway. Good job, Virginia. Right on. And then there's a cultivar that is the most common of all as well, the Crimson King, which has that red foliage. So the Crimson King is a Norway maple. It's a non-native. I have not seen it be invasive in Virginia, but I came from Pennsylvania before I came to Virginia in 2001, and there were places where it was spreading naturally, and that's not good. It starts out a little bit and then becomes a bigger problem. All right, let's move on to our number 2 species in terms of numbers of trees in Virginia, and that would be loblolly or Pinus taedia. This is a true pine. Spruce are spruce, not pine. Fir are fir, not pine. We sometimes, talk about the pine trees as anything with needles. But this is the most commonly planted pine. It's the most important tree economically in the whole southeastern U.S. It's been heavily researched. There's been a lot of work done to it with genetic improvement to get it to grow fast, tall, straight. So it's a very important tree. Sometimes, depending on what circles you might be in, it gets a little bit of a bad rap because of monocultures. When it is planted in a monoculture, it is not a monoculture. It may be the only tree planted, but there's almost always a lot of other species in the mix. And one thing that we tell landowners who want a hardwood forest, if they're starting with a field, or if they're starting with a clear cut, maybe the forest was degraded over time, very common situation, and but they want hardwood species. The best way to get a good hardwood forest, especially oak, is, if you're starting from scratch, is to plant pine trees. And that follows just the natural succession of a forested system. It prepares the site well for hardwood trees, which are more particular in their soil preferences and mycorrhizae, so on, etc. And it also has a the right light mix to prepare a site for oak and other hardwood species. It's a gymnosperm. Pine trees are gymnosperms, which means that the seed is not inside of a fleshy fruit, right? It's inside of those pine cones, so it's called kind of a naked seed. Now, this word loblolly, very interesting word, I think. It sounds kind of funny, and there's a famous book, author, gosh, I shouldn't have brought it up because I can't think of it right now. Author's from Indiana, and she wrote a book, but it means kind of wet, and it got a name after I just found this in this book, The Common Native Trees of Virginia, that the gruel, the mush, girl of Limberlost. Thank you, Robbie. Yes. Made some kind of gruel on the ship, and it was dark and mucky, just like the soil where this naturally grows. I'll point out this native range. You see that it's fairly confined to the southeast, and for those of you who are outside of that green area in Virginia, you know that you've seen loblolly pine outside of that area. And yes, you have. In fact, it is planted all the way up into Pennsylvania. So it's planted outside of its native range, but it is a native to the southeastern and south central part of Virginia. Here's what it looks like. One of the things I use to remember to identify this pine from other pines is the 3 needles per fascicle. So there in that middle picture, you see 3 needles per grouping, okay? And lob is the way it's often abbreviated, L-O-B, 3 letters, 3 needles. The picture in the upper left is a recently thinned pine stand. On this pine cone, you see it's called armored scale. So it has a little kind of thorn, if you will, at the end of each whatever that's called on a pine cone. And there's a close picture of male and female parts of the tree and the wood behind it. Sorry. So why is it valuable from an economic perspective? It is used to make dimensional lumber, especially pressure treated lumber. And so Virginia is uniquely situated, commercially speaking, because north of us, while it's planted up into Pennsylvania, we are sort of at the northern end of its range where it grows really well. And so pine grown here, treated lumber is shipped all the way up into New England because they can't grow this tree. So it's a very important tree economically, which is important to us and for lots of reasons. It keeps the forest industry going. And if we can keep a strong forest industry, then we keep forest land, and that's important for wildlife and recreation and all things we value woods for. Some other pines of Virginia, the Virginia pine, we'll talk about that. The shortleaf, that is the native southern yellow pine to a larger area of Virginia. Longleaf is also native to Virginia, but to a very small part in southeast Virginia. And then pitch pine, pond pine, Table Mountain pine. All of these that I just read and the one that we just talked about are in a group called Southern Yellow Pine. And they all have some similar wood kind of attributes in terms of they can be used in similar ways. The only non-Southern Yellow Pine that we have in Virginia is the Eastern White Pine. And this too has been commonly planted, unfortunately, in many places where it doesn't do well long-term. It is a mountain species. You see that in its range map on this picture. Excuse me, I'm going to clear my voice, but I'm going to mute myself first. If I can find the mute button, there it is. So again, looking at that native range map, we see white pine planted outside of that all the time. And we generally see it not doing well outside of that in this case. Our heavy soils, hot temperatures in the Piedmont and south side of Virginia are not conducive to this species. And this species has 5 needles, WHITE, per fascicle. All righty, moving on. Here's my favorite tree. If you don't have a favorite tree, you're welcome to join me in this one. One of the things I love about it is its scientific name, Liliodendron tulipifera. Just rolls off of the tongue, makes me sound smart, even though I'm not. And so I love this tree. It's beautiful in its form. And so when I say number one, I'm saying it's number one because, well, it's number one in my mind. It's it oscillates between that and between itself and loblolly for the most volume of wood in Virginia. It's the tallest of the hardwood species in the eastern U.S. It's very fast growing. It is straight, self prunes. I think it's very magnificent. And it's sweet. Bees love it. Bees use it to make lots of honey, and it's useful for lots of stuff. So it is a valued wood species as well, mostly for interior wood uses such as drawer liners and cabinetry and stuff like that. The wood itself is not all that beautiful, but it's very, very straight and very easy to work with. All right, let's take a look at some pictures of it. Its leaf is very unique. That's one thing I like about it. People will describe it as a cat face silhouette or a tulip. And so that's fine. The flower looks very much like a tulip, which is where it gets part of its common name from. The bark just has that white kind of inside of the ridges. And a stately tree. Some people don't like its seed, and it's not comfortable barefoot. I will give you that. So you see a little seed cone here on the right-hand side. Those fall apart. They're also whirligig kind of seeds, wind dispersed, and the seed itself has a pretty sharp point that's not comfortable on bare feet. Another unique thing about the tree is it's terminal bud cover. It's a valvate, so it only has 2 bud scales on it, and it looks like a duckbill. And here's the national champion right here in Virginia of the tulip poplar tree. It is amongst the biggest trees that we have, and pretty awesome. It's also called canoe wood, by the way, because they used it to make dugout canoes. All right, here's another one that is fun to say. Liquidambar strassifila. Anyone know what that is? It is sweet gum. In the Southeast, it's considered a weed tree, and from the forestry side of things, a lot of homeowners don't like it because of the gumballs. They're kind of neat when first time you see a gumball, like, oh wow, that's really cool. What kind of craft can I make out of this? And then you see, bushels and bushels and bushels of full of these on the ground, and they become not so neat. It is good as a landscape tree. There are cultivars that are seedless and also have a rounded leaf lobe rather than pointed, but we'll take a look at that here in a sec. The name liquidambar refers to a liquid in amber that comes out of the tree if you wound the bark. And that is actually used as a medicinal. You can look it up. It's even on WebMD, believe it or not. I just noticed that. I didn't dig into a little bit very far, but if you're interested, you can. Here are the pictures. There's a sweet gum ball. Kind of neat looking, but not comfortable on bare feet. The leaves, I think, are really neat. The first tree I remember seeing was outside my dorm room at Purdue. I'm like, oh, that's a really cool leaf. And so I like that. The bud itself, that terminal bud, you see how it's kind of glossy? It's also sticky, sort of like the amber that comes out of the tree, wounded bark. The fall color can be real nice. And the bark is sort of nondescript, but there it is. All right, how many are we down into? Is this our number 5 tree? Anyone counting? This is whatever number it is, we're at American Holly. This is mostly valuable for ornamental reasons. It's a great tree in yards. In the forest, it can become too much. It becomes too much as a result of past management or mismanagement. And it just overtakes the understory and can become quite a fire hazard. It's very flammable. It does have wildlife value. The red berries are useful to the wildlife. And while it doesn't really have commercial value, the wood is used for the white piano keys or organ keys. And so that's one of its historical uses and still used for that. Is just that's very low volume. So you can imagine it doesn't have much commercial value for that reasons. And here is some pictures. The red berry, very evident. The spiny leaves, so it's pretty to look at, not so wonderful to handle, but is used as an ornamental at Christmas time, bringing in some of that evergreen leaf. The flowers, I've seen a lot of bees around these when they're blooming, so there must be some value there. The bark is smooth, and it is an understory tree by nature, but will grow, in the shade in your yard or in the wide open. All right, let's talk about one more pine tree. This is our pine. It's a Virginia pine. It's even in the Latin name, Pinus virginiana. And as I was putting this slide together, I'm like, man, I wish this wasn't our pine. It's just kind of a disappointing tree. So I do have some silver lining here for you, but it doesn't look like much unless you can spin that and say, well, it does have character. It's not a very big tree. It's a small tree. So there's some value to that, but then it falls over in wind and snow. And so it's kind of like, I'm trying to like this tree because it has our name in it, but I'm struggling. The best thing about it is that it can grow anywhere. It is one of the most successful pioneer species used to reclaim minefields. If you've got a tough site at your yard, then this would probably do just fine. It's also known as field pine or scrub pine. And so you can kind of even hear the connotation there of like, whatever. It does have some lumber value. It's harvested for pulpwood when it's in the woods already. People don't grow this on purpose, but it is utilized, and even for Christmas trees, but probably on the lower end, well, definitely on the lower end of preferred species for Christmas trees. Some pictures of the tree, much more of an orangish bark color to it. The pine cone here, you can see these armored scales a little better. These pine cones are more on the order of a couple inches, whereas the loblolly pine is bigger. But this also has the armored pine scales. This has 2 needles, which VA, the abbreviation for our state, 2 needles, and they tend to be a little twisted. And so that's one of the distinguishing ID characteristics of this pine tree over loblolly. All right, we're going to talk about 2 oaks, but I want to talk about the oak groups first of all. Oaks are divided. Okay, there's live oaks. Put that aside. We're not really talking about that, but our deciduous oaks, most common oaks in Virginia, are divided into the red oak group and the white oak group. And the red oak species I have listed there, the white oak species I have listed there, there's 3 main differences between these species. The wood is different, and that's the big deal on a commercial side of things. If you try to make a barrel out of anything in the red oak group, guess what'll happen? You can hold dry goods, but not wet goods. It'll run right through it. If you make a barrel out of white oak, it is watertight, it is waterproof. It has closed cells or tyloses in the wood. And so white oak is valued for cooperage. In fact, the bourbon industry has really made this a big deal in the past few years. It's sort of a poster child for the bourbon industry, as well as wine and so on, et cetera. So if you ever see a barrel, it's made out of white oak. A couple of the other distinguishing features, red oak acorns will overwinter before they germinate. White oak acorns fall and germinate that season. And as far as identification goes, anything with a little bristle tip, not necessarily coming to a point, but a little bristle tip on the end of the lobe, that's going to be in the red oak group. If it's without a bristle tip, it may be rounded, it may come to a point, but there'll be no little bristle tip, which is not pokey, it's not sharp, but it looks like it would be. That's going to be in the white oak group. Okay? And here's a politically incorrect way to help you remember that. Red man's arrow comes to a point, white man's bullet is more rounded. All right, so the first oak in our top 10 is the white oak, and many people would argue that this is the best oak for a variety of reasons. It is very valuable for wildlife. The fat content is high. It is a preferred acorn for wildlife. From a timber perspective, it has the best timber, mostly because of its form. All the wood in all the white oak group, the wood would be pretty much the same, but white oak has the best form. It'll be most clear, not have as many knots, and so on. It's long lived. It's probably one of our longest lived oak trees, and it gets to massive size. And so it's an iconic tree, and it's a beloved tree. Part of its history, well, it's all over the place. Anyone know of a plank road near them? That was probably a wooden road made out of white oak at one time. Or you know about the story about old Ironsides or the USS Constitution. It's nicknamed the Ironsides, in part because of the white oak that was used to make it, along with live oak. And I mentioned that it's a current poster child. So we are interested in getting oak, better oak regeneration throughout the state of all oak species. The white oak is sort of the poster child because of these sort of reasons. Quercus alba. You see that bark? That's even useful for bats as a place to nestle in under its cover. All oak trees have these grouping of buds like you see at the end, with a terminal bud and some immediate lateral buds. Here you see, yes, in this case, rounded lobes, but the absence of bristle tip at the end puts it in the white oak group. There's a little picture of a little flower, pretty nondescript, but cute little thing if you get up close enough. The acorns and then the tree, not a very good picture in the woods of a mature, stately tree in the woods. Our next oak, and the only other oak in the top 10, is the chestnut oak. And I reckon it's in the top 10 because it's been left on the ridgetops where it's not very accessible and its form is not very useful from a commercial standpoint. It tends to be I think, a very beautiful tree, but it has a lot of character. It doesn't grow up and have its branches up high. It's kind of all over the place. Really neat looking trees, sometimes called rock oak. Like many oaks, it's intermediate shade tolerant. Now, shade tolerance, y'all are gardeners, so let's talk a little bit about that. That just means it tolerates shade. It doesn't mean it likes it, okay? So anything that tolerates shade is probably going to be okay in the full sun, whereas things that are shade intolerant will not be okay in the shade. So it's sort of interesting way that we have of phrasing all that. But oaks will compete better in intermediate shade tolerance against trees that are not shade tolerant. So our tulip poplar is not shade tolerant. If we have some shade in a system, in a forested system, we're not going to regenerate tulip poplar there very well, or pine trees, but we might give the competitive advantage to oak trees in that situation. This too, chestnut oak is a white oak, so its wood is characteristic of that. Has plenty of value for wildlife as well. And it's called chestnut oak because the leaves look like chestnut. Now, I was just reminded of this not too long ago. I don't know when it happened, but we used to refer to chestnut oak and swamp chestnut oak as Quercus prinus. And that has been changed. Those are two separate species. It's been decided by botanists. So Quercus montana is the chestnut oak. And here we have some pictures, notably that leaf that does look like an American chestnut in many ways. And the bark is real tight and very hard. That's a great tree. Hornbeam. Anyone familiar with hornbeam? I think this is one of our most underappreciated trees from a landscape perspective. It's not got a whole lot of value in the woods. It's just an understory tree. It's got some value for wildlife and so on, et cetera. And it's used to make tool handles because it is a very hard wood. But I think it's a pretty neat tree. The common names are very confusing between this and hop hornbeam. Also, some people call that one hornbeam and they call this one hop hornbeam. And they call both of them ironwood. And so what we're talking about here is Carpinus carolinea, and it has a smooth bark. I grew up calling it musclewood because it has a kind of a striated, if I had a very muscular arm, I'd show you, kind of that muscular look to it. And well, let's just take a look at it. There you go. There's some of that musclewood look to it. So Carpinus carolina or hornbeam. The leaves are not all that exciting. The bark is really cool. And when it's flowering, it gets these what's called nutlets. And that looks pretty cool too. And so from a gardening landscape perspective, I think this tree has a lot of, could be used a lot more. There's a better picture of the nutlet that forms at the end of the twigs. Is this tree number 8? I don't know. I think so. Nope, that was tree number 10. So we move through the top 10 trees, okay? So now I'm going to spend some time on a few other native species just to show you how beautiful they can be if you're not already familiar with them. And most of these pictures are going to come out of the Remarkable Trees book. Some of you may remember that. That was put together with input from, with guidance from a professor at Virginia Tech who's now retired, and an author. I'll give you the credit here a little bit later. But here, talking about oaks, is the state champion at the time, maybe still is, of the northern red oak, or Quercus rubra. And so massive tree, flowering dogwood, our state tree. Look how big and beautiful that can be. Downy serviceberry, probably another one that is underused, underappreciated in the landscape. A beautiful tree that blooms very early, has an interesting story with its name. Why is it called serviceberry? I've heard a couple of different things. When it blooms, then the ground is sufficiently thawed that we can dig a grave to bury those who died through the winter is one of them. Shadbush is another name for it. The shad are running in the stream. So a neat tree. And along these lines, some of these other sort of small to medium sized trees, the redbud we're all familiar with, box elder, I mentioned that earlier, that's a type of maple. And then the ironwood or the musclewood, which the picture on the right is which one? It's the musclewood. The picture on the left is the Australia virginiana, or the hop hornbeam or ironwood. This is one where common names are kind of useless because it can be interchangeable between two completely different species, even not in the same genus. Water tupelo, beautiful, nice oak aquatica. I think that is just, this is a neat tree, of course, in a neat spot. But it too has almost every tupelo has just a unique character to it. If you get a chance to go kayaking in the black waters of Southeast Virginia, you'll see lots of these. Cherry bark oak, another oak that's not very common. It develops a bark that looks sort of like a cherry tree. Yep, it's another oak. I mean, this one's massive. I can't believe that house is not like lifted up off of that. Cucumber tree. So this is one of the closer relatives that we have to my favorite tree, Liliodendron tulipifera, because the Liliodendron tulipifera, or tulip tree, is in the Magnolia family. And this one is in the Magnolia genus, Magnolia acuminata. A beautiful tree, not very common. It doesn't usually look like this. This is, you know, a old open grown tree. You can even see the cabling there kind of holding it together. But in the forest, it will look somewhat like a tulip tree. Just really neat. If you happen to find one, that's quite a good find. I've not seen very many in Virginia. Some other great native trees. The picture is of the black gum, another underappreciated tree. Great fall color. Outside of the fall color, it does have a great pyramidal form, good horizontal branching, and then just some other species there. Sycamore, hackberry. Sycamore has great, beautiful bark, as you know. A London plane tree, a related tree, but not native. So our American sycamore, a good native tree. People give it say it's a dirty tree, and it does. It drops branches and leaves and so on, etc. But that's great. Persimmon. I've got persimmon fruit all over the ground where I live right now, so I've been snacking on that when I'm walking around the yard. American persimmon. As soon as those, so the reputation of persimmon is that you have to have a frost before you can eat the fruit, and that's not true. Once they drop, then they're ripe. But before they drop, if you try to eat them, it's very astringent, and you'll have your puckered up mouth for quite a while. Hickory trees, cedar trees, another unappreciated tree, I think. Very, it's considered another wheat tree by some, but the cedar, which is not a cedar, it's a juniper, Juniperus virginiana, a great tree, long-lived, tough, really doesn't have any troubles, any problems, and a lot of character with it. And then I have a question by maple, because maple, as far as a planted tree, is one of the most, not only is it the most common tree in our forest, it's also the most commonly planted tree. In street trees, a survey was done by Virginia Tech, street tree communities in Virginia, it's the #1 planted genus. And that's a bit of a problem because something that, disease or impacts usually are species or genus specific, and diversity is always a good idea. And so I will probably never, well, I shouldn't say that. I don't like to plant maple trees. I'd like to try to plant other things to increase the diversity in whether it's an urban or suburban area. One more. Anyone have a guess about what this one might be? I wouldn't from that picture. This was an old one, and old trees develop a lot of character and no longer look kind of normal. So this is a sassafras, a huge sassafras. I have never seen anything even close to that big in sassafras. I did have one in my backyard that was very big. It was double stemmed, and it was a little over a foot in each trunk, and that's quite large, but nothing compared to this. And that could be a great tree to plant. You're very unique leaves, 4 different leaf types. So another one. This is the book that I mentioned. Sorry for the kind of grainy picture, but Remarkable Trees of Virginia. Probably have a hard time finding the book now. It's not in print, but Nancy Ross Hugo took the pictures. Gosh, just blanked on Jeff's last name. He was an extension specialist down at Virginia Tech. Was kind of the science for it, and the photography was by Robert Llewellyn, a well-known photographer in Virginia, in Charlottesville, Virginia. So beautiful stuff. All right, real quickly, non-native invasive plants. We kind of interchange these terms sometimes. I think this is a useful context for a talk on native plants, but native does not necessarily mean it's not necessarily a versus thing. Okay, so not all things that are non-native are invasive. Corn, cattle, poultry, these are all non-native. Are they invasive? Not in Virginia. Not yet, anyway. And I don't think they will be. We've had them here for a long, long time. But we do have a lot of exotic plants. And of those, many are invasive. And 94 of them are even categorized as federal noxious weeds, which to achieve that designation, they have to have some health and hazard risk to people. There's lots of reasons why invasive plants are bad. There's ecological reasons and there's economical reasons. So I'm not going to go through that, but whatever side we want to argue, it can be argued very well. But some general characteristics of invasive species is that they grow fast, they make seed at a young age, they make lots of seed, and they distribute it widely. And this picture on the right-hand side, going back to my first slide of the talk, is of the non-native tree species. That's my favorite one to hate. So stay tuned. We're about ready to unveil that. No, I think I'll do it now. It is the tree of heaven, Ailanthus tree. Some people call it shumac or sumac or paradise tree, but it's Ailanthus altissima. And you can see there in that picture the fruit, high numbers of fruit on a very young tree that's already establishing. How do you control invasive species? Well, there's a variety of options, but when it comes to woody plants, we're really boiling it down to herbicide. If you cut, if you pull, you're leaving some stuff behind that will sprout. That's what woody plants do if they have enough health in them. So while some people are averse to herbicides, I think that in this situation with invasive species, it should be considered as a kind of separate topic. If you don't want to use pesticides in your garden, that's one thing. But in landscape, this is pretty much what it boils down to for woody plants. But we do want to keep in mind that when we're talking about vegetation management, it needs to be an integrated approach using multiple tools. So while we're using herbicides, it's probably not the only thing we're using because we want to establish something that follows that space as well. There's different ways of applying herbicides. Just real quickly to dip into this, it's not just foliar, which is good news because a lot of our woody plants are big, right? They're tall. How can we get to those leaves? And so there's certain products that we can use just to spray the trunk of the tree, the bottom of it. And that can be effective. If we do cut it, then we can put a product on the stump. It needs to be put on quickly to kill that. And both of these are effective at, and this one too, hack and squirt, making little hacks through the bark and applying the right kind of chemical. These are all effective at controlling tree of heaven and any other woody plant, whether invasive or non-invasive. There we go, the Ailanthus. Yeah, if you don't have a favorite tree to hate, I would definitely invite you to join me on this one. We've got other non-native trees. Paulownia would be the next one that comes to my mind. As far as trees go, those are probably the main two. But this one is everywhere. And with the spotted lanternfly addition to Virginia, this is another reason not to like this tree. It form monocultures like this, and there's not much else going on there. Asian longhorn beetle. The last detection of this was in South Carolina, Hollywood, South Carolina. I actually got to see it. I was down there visiting some family. And this is a threat to maple trees. In South Carolina, it's putting a hurt on the red maple trees, which they're kind of like I am, so what? But it is a big part of their system. So it's, if it's just one or two trees, fine. But if it kills everything, not so good. So it's something to keep an eye out for. I'm not going to go into this, just some pictures for you here. They're big, pretty obvious. insect. These are little egg niches. They're about the size of your thumb. You can kind of put your thumb in that space, and they're easy to see. And then they result in that bleeding, sawdust coming out from larval feeding, big holes. Here's a way to, if you see a hole this size in a tree, please let someone know, because there's not anything else that I can think of that makes this big of an exit hole from a tree. With that, I'll say thank you with some acknowledgments given, and happy to have a conversation, answer some questions if I can. And one last question, if you got an idea about what this species might be. We haven't talked about it at all, but it's a neat tree. I don't know that I would guess it with that picture, but look at that character. That's the catalpa tree. And we have both northern and southern catalpa in Virginia. And I have trouble telling the difference. I like them both. All right. So, Devin, questions?
Thanks. Thank you so much, Adam. That was awesome. I feel like I could listen all day to you just list different kinds of interesting trees.
Well,
So
you can play the recording, I guess, right?
I could, yeah. I
Thank
can
you.
definitely do that. We have a number of questions that people have been putting in the chat. If you think of any more, just go ahead and stick them in there and we'll look for them. Somebody asked in the beginning the influence of tourism in Virginia for fall color. How much of a industry is tourism for fall color?
I don't have a solid answer for that. My understanding is that it's, the tourism people want and the forestry people want it to be significant, but I don't know. I imagine that there might be a solid answer to that. I would say that the Northeast gets the reputation for the fall colors, and that's largely because of the sugar maple. But the mountains of Virginia have really great colors too, because of some of the species we listed here. The tulip poplars turning a great yellow, the black gum turning a great red, sugar maple in some of the mountain areas. So we got a lot of variety as well. So I don't know. I will say this. I used to kind of get into trying to predict, along with some others, when, what was going to make a good fall color year. And I sort of gave up because I think they're all great. I mean, what's not, maybe some years have a little bit more one color than the other, but we're always going to have some color. Thanks for the question. Sorry, I don't have a good answer.
That was a great answer, I think. Another question, are red maples pollinated by insects?
Yes. There may also be some wind pollination, but I have seen insects for sure on them.
Okay, another question. How well does hornbeam do in full sun?
Um, I think it does all right. I'm trying to think of places where I've seen it. I've not seen it in the full sun very often, maybe just once or twice, but as I have a vague recollection of that, it was doing fine. I had one in a house we used to live in here in Madison that was in kind of on the edge. It was mostly out of the edge of the forest, and it was doing great, but I wouldn't call that full sun. It was probably 80 some percent sun.
All right, another question here. How come no elms or sycamores made the lists?
Good question. They're just not in the top 10 as far as numbers of trees, according to the forest and inventory analysis um, um, survey, which has been done for decades and decades. So it's a pretty rigorous process. Sycamores will mostly be found along floodplains, and so they're a very common tree, and where they're in the right site. But that's a pretty defined area. And elms, there are not. I mean, it's not an uncommon tree, but it's not a common tree in the forest. Um, I was looking for a picture to include here instead of this catalpa of a great elm tree there at Virginia Tech. Devin, you may know it. That's up against one of the dormitories, I think. But anyway, Also great trees. Love them. So this is not the list of the best trees. This is just the top 10 most common.
And then Grant asks, can you talk a little bit about black locust?
Sure. I like black locust. And some people be like, what the heck? It has thorns. Yes, it does. The black locust is considered by some to be invasive. It's not invasive by definition, but it is an early invader. It is an early successional species. And so it does well in field conditions and sort of occupies that site at an early stage. But trees that are native and do that as early colonizers will kind of fade out of the system as other trees come in, whereas our non-native species slow that whole successional process down. And so black locust, great for, I see, yeah, they smell nice. They're great for pollinators. I think they look pretty neat. The leaves are nice because they're small, so you can mow over them easy. The wood is highly rot resistant and has a high BTU value as firewood. And so I like it. I wouldn't let my kids climb it, but
Adam, everybody loves you. This was a great presentation, and everyone's saying, let us know what other presentations you do. So we'll have to have you back, nice. Or maybe some of the local units. Okay.
I think master gardeners are easy to please, but thank you.
Okay. Mary wants to know, for the Asian longhorn beetle, which trees are a threat?
Maple primarily, but it is a long list of species. I might have that on a slide. I can go back and leave it up here. Well, there are 220 species as far as the host range, but maples are the big one, and I mean it's the most common tree. So
yeah, not a good
combination. I think elm was on the list, as I recall. I don't know what else.
And then someone asks, can you talk a little bit about mimosa and ornamental pears in terms of invasives?
Yeah, mimosa is an interesting tree. I didn't know that tree until I came to Virginia. I'm like, well, that's pretty. And then I found out what it was, and I was like, okay, I shouldn't think it's pretty. And then I went to Hawaii for to visit some friends, the one opportunity to kind of do that. And I saw magnificent mimosa in Hawaii, also non-native and invasive there too. But it is a beautiful tree, but it is non-native. It is classified as invasive. I have not personally seen it ever in the woods. I'm not in the woods every day, but I have not seen it in the woods or spreading other than sort of right around itself. So I don't get too excited about it. There's some sort of, I don't remember what it is, some sort of decline that it gets and can kind of suddenly die, as I recall. But I don't give any. I've not thought about mimosa for quite a while, honestly. So I'm digging through the recesses of my mind for something, and I think that's about it.
What about ornamental pears?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, bad. So ornamental pears, Callery pear is a big grouping. Bradford pear is the most common one of the Callery pears. There's multiple cultivars and varieties. The first one was developed as a sterile variety. Each other variety is sterile, but they're not sterile amongst themselves, and so they have become a major invasive problem. I've seen many fields just full of this and very difficult to get on top of once it dominates a site. As it escapes cultivation, it forms a very large thorn. It's actually a fruit spur, but it's effectively a thorn. And yeah, South Carolina, where these pictures came from for the Asian longhorn beetle, they have a bounty program that some other states have adopted to kill your pear trees, take pictures showing that you've cut it down, and we'll give you a free tree. So if any master gardener is looking for a really neat project, that I would love to see that in Virginia. We just need someone to put the time into it.
maybe somebody knows, but I thought there was a locality in Virginia that started their own bounty program. I thought I saw one of the, maybe somebody will know what I'm talking about and put it in the chat. Somebody asked about the effect of moisture and rainfall on fall color.
Yeah. So with the reds, so as a tree leaf is senescing, getting ready to separate from the tree, the reds come out with the anthocyanins, I think is the pigment, which comes out from the sugars. And so if we have a drought and there's not a lot of photosynthetic activity, then there's going to be less sugars in the leaf and therefore less anthocyanins or reds exhibiting as the green chlorophyll fades out. So yeah, that is a factor for sure. And generally what people are using to base their predictions of fall color is the moisture and temperature thing. I'll also say that with fall color, people put more on temperature than they should. Temperature does have an influence on when trees change and lose their leaves, but the biggest driver of that is the length of daylight. And so that is really what triggers the leaf color change more than the temperature. Although temperature is a factor, which we can see as we look at mountaintops changing earlier than down low. Some of that also is species. And I see Dennis, thank you. Bradford pears are your love to hate tree. That's a good one too.
Worse. So Beth also said that it's Blacksburg that has a bounty program for Calorie pears. So that
cool.
might be interesting to know. That might make a good webinar, how they were able to, pay for that and organize it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We have time for like one more question here. Can you talk a little bit about symptoms of drought stress?
The symptoms of drought stress? Wilting leaves, early drop. That's pretty much it. In our forest, drought is not usually a big factor, but in landscape situations, it certainly can be. So it's interesting because trees in the landscape, you would think maybe don't have as much competition because they're not surrounded by other trees, but they actually have greater competition because of the grass in most landscapes. Grass roots and tree roots are in the same place, and grass is pretty tough. It's going to get what it needs. And our fescue lawns, a non-native species, is good for our lawns, but not so good for our trees in most cases. And I also want, real quick, if I can, Devin, wild cherry. The question is that also a non-native? No, it's a native, but it is also an early successional species, so it can have a little bit of those characteristics of invading a site, but it's doing what it's supposed to do in terms of succession.
Perfect. And then just before we all go here, where can people find, if they want to find the reports that the tree inventories that you based this presentation on?
Yeah,
where can they find those?
The Virginia Department of Forestry is the one that does that forest inventory analysis. And if you do a search just with those terms in your search, Virginia Department of Forestry, forest inventory or something along those lines, I think you would find it. I think you may also find it if you simply do the top 10 trees in Virginia. So there's, but you want to get to something that is Virginia Department of Forestry. If you get to that place, then you're in a good, in the right spot.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Adam. We really appreciate this. I have recorded this, so there will be a recording. I post them all on our website, which I'm going to put the link in the chat here. And I'll try and do that this week.
All right.
And I will plan to see all of y'all back here on November 17th at 1 p.m. for Landscaping for Birds with Dr. Robin Puffenbarger. Thanks so much, Adam. We really appreciate the time
you took. Thanks for being a great host, Devin. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.